a type of nerve cell which transmits electrochemical signals from one part of the body to another. Specifically, this occurs between the central and peripheral nervous systems. The signal travels in one direction in the neuron pathway in order for messages to accurately be carried throughout the body. The dendrites are the branch-like part of the neuron connected to the cell body, and they receive information from other neurons. The axon is the trunk-like part of the neuron, and it transmits signals to other neurons. The axon is covered in myelin that acts as insulation, with little bits of exposed neuron in between chunks of myelin called nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier allow signals to travel down the neuron faster through saltatory conduction. The cell body connects the dendrites and the axon, and it contains the nucleus. The cell body is also responsible for making dendrites and neurotransmitters.
The resting potential tells about what happens when a neuron is at rest. An action potential occurs when a neuron sends information down an axon away from the cell body. The action potential is an explosion of electrical activity that is created by a depolarization. When the depolarization reaches about negative 55 millivolts, a neuron will fire an action potential. This is the threshold. If the neuron does not reach this critical threshold level, then no action potential will fire. A stimulus first causes sodium channels to open. Because there are many more sodium ions on the outside, and the inside of the neuron is negative relative to the outside, sodium ions rush into the neuron. Sodium has a positive charge, so the neuron becomes more positive and depolarized. It takes longer for potassium channels to open. When they do open, potassium rushes out of the cell, reversing the depolarization. Also, at about this time, sodium channels start to close. This causes the action potential to go back towards negative 70 millivolts. The action potential actually goes past negative 70 millivolts in what is called hyperpolarization because the potassium channels stay open a bit too long. Gradually, the ion concentrations go back to resting levels and the cell returns to negative 70 millivolts.
To return back to the resting membrane potential, a sodium-potassium pump is used. The sodium-potassium pump generates and maintains the ionic gradients of sodium and potassium, using ATP to actively transport sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into the cell. For every 3 sodium ions transported out of the cell, 2 potassium ions are transported into the cell. Ion movement through ion channels causes voltage differences as ions diffuse through channels. Any resulting net movement of positive or negative charge will generate a membrane potential.
The synapse is the area between the end of an axon of the presynaptic cell and the dendrites of the postsynaptic cell. Postsynaptic cells can be many types of neurons and other cells. When the action potential reaches the synaptic terminal, the plasma membrane depolarizes, thus opening voltage-gated channels. These channels allow calcium to diffuse into the terminal. Calcium releases the neurotransmitters out of the presynaptic cell through diffusion by vesicles across the synaptic cleft of the first neuron. The neurotransmitters then bind to the receptors in the postsynaptic cell. This allows for the signal to be received and carried out throughout that cell. Ultimately, this chemical signaling process between cells is responsible for every activity that we must do in order to move and survive.